Okay, so let's talk about Unit 5. Unit 5 is going to cover land and water use, and I'm going to group Unit 5 together a little bit differently so that we talk about the land and water use, and then we talk about the sustainability of that land and water use. The unit's kind of divided up into the whole entire first half of the unit, if you just read the textbook in order, is going to go through and talk about the land and water use and how we take all those resources. And then the second half of the unit is how we do that sustainably. So I'm going to be just dividing things up just a little bit, and make sure you're following the tracker for that. And then you'll be able to see all the notes that I do for each of these sections as well. If you follow the tracker. Okay, so this is a really good case study about how younger, I guess not all younger people, but a lot of younger people tried to make a difference for how we use our public lands and how we use those for what purpose. So I highly recommend this as a nice case study to know for the tragedy of the commons. All right, and so then Module 24, let's jump into that. That is going to go along with 5.1, Tragedy of the Commons. They also talk about clear cutting in this, which has a lot to do with Tragedy of the Commons. But Tragedy of the Commons involves lots of different public and shared resources. Many times it involves water, so our world's oceans, which technically don't belong to anybody. And then also clear cutting is another good example of how we experience tragedy of the commons on public land. So make sure that you understand what the tragedy of the commons is. And so they really go through it in this section here and this section as well. This is how it can occur with land use when we're talking about public lands, especially out west where there's a lot of grazing lands and we have cattle and sheep and things like that that graze the land. If you ever watch the series Yellowstone, it really goes into the grazing of the land, especially before it was owned by big corporations or by large private-owned landowners, or before the government actually took over responsibility for managing those lands. So make sure that you understand how that works. You should also know what an externality is, so make sure that you read through this section here. And then how do we use our public lands in the United States? So this kind of goes over the protected land and the protected marine areas throughout the world. And this actually talks about how we use federal land in the United States. So those are both really good diagrams to make sure that you look at. This next section talks about land management and how that differs when we're talking about rangeland versus forest. And so that is something that would be really good to explore as well. And then when they talk about forests, they're talking about different timber harvesting practices, including clear cutting, which is a real battle for some of the public lands out west. Not so much here in this part of the country, but definitely because there's a lot of private landowners in this country, or in this section of the country, but out west, there's a lot of public lands. And then this goes along with tree harvesting techniques, this table. And so I think that's a really good table to make sure that you understand so that you know the difference between clear cutting, selective cutting, and then sustainable forestry. And understanding the pros and cons of each practice is really important. So that is something that you'll want to look over. And then looking at how management of forests can actually influence biodiversity. And then that would bring us to the end of Module 24. Now, Module 24 definitely goes into forestry and not just tragedy of the commons. So forestry is actually something, go back and take a look at my tracker really quickly. Forestry is something that we'll talk about more when we get to Day 3 of Unit 5. So clear cutting is section 5.2 in the AP curriculum, and then sustainable forestry is 5.17. So, but make sure you read through that section as you're reading this module, because those are very important concepts that you will have to know later. Okay, the next module will cover the Green Revolution, which is section 5.3 and the APES curriculum. And we'll talk to you guys next time.